This is a new video on the removal of government subsidies. It's part of the sequence of videos 4.3.3 on the Edexcel syllabus, market-orientated strategies influencing economic growth and economic development. So what do we actually mean by subsidies? What happens when we remove subsidies? A subsidy is a sum of money given by the government to the producer of a particular good or service. Typically, subsidies are paid to firms on a per unit supplied basis. Therefore, the total subsidy received by a firm is a function of two variables. The first of these variables is the rate of subsidy, and the second is the volume or quantity of goods produced that are attracting the subsidy. So examples of subsidies would include the subsidy that dairy farmers receive from the European Union in exchange for producing milk. So the subsidy is something like 7p for every litre of milk produced by a dairy farmer. So the bigger the farm, the more cows, the more milk, the more subsidy income that you'll receive, because the subsidy is paid per litre of milk produced. So subsidies incentivize firms to produce more. Another example of a subsidy might be given to solar farms who produce electricity generated from a sustainable source. Sometimes governments use subsidies for environmental reasons, in this case to try to reduce CO2 emissions. Subsidies offset production costs. Therefore, removing a subsidy will decrease the profitability of supply. Firms will respond to falling profit margins out of self-interest by decreasing market supply from S1 to S2. The decrease in supply will cause the equilibrium quantity to fall from Q1 to Q2. The decrease in supply will also cause the market equilibrium price to increase from P1 to P2. So in essence then, what subsidies do is that they decrease the equilibrium quantity and they increase the equilibrium price. That's what happens when you remove subsidies. Removing subsidies is an example of price liberalisation. The aim of price liberalisation is to restore real market prices by removing forms of government intervention that are designed to influence the price level in a micro market. Abolishing subsidies isn't the only way to achieve price liberalisation. The government could also abolish indirect taxes and remove maximum and minimum prices from a micro market. Say why it might work. So here what we're going to look at is arguments in favour of the idea that if we remove subsidies, that might create economic growth and economic development. The first argument is that if we remove subsidies, we'll create economic development because the economy will become more productively efficient. So it's often said that firms which receive subsidies come to become dependent upon those subsidies. By removing subsidies, only the most efficient farmers will be able to survive. Firms now have to make an effort. They have a far greater incentive to become more efficient. This will force farmers into adopting new methods of production. Therefore, it's possible that removing subsidies could increase output per worker, because I say, like, farmers will have to become efficient themselves. They can't rely on subsidies if subsidies have been taken away from them. So if productivity does rise, the productive capacity of the economy will increase. And this will lead to economic development, because the more that an economy can produce, the more it will be able to consume. Second argument is that if we remove subsidies, we'll create economic development, because by getting rid of subsidies, we'll make the economy more allocatively efficient. Allocative efficiency exists when society's scarce resources are being used in a manner that's going to maximise society's total utility or welfare. So what's really important to understand here is that there's more to maximising society's welfare than maximising output. To maximise economic welfare, total utility, whatever we're going to call it, the economy's output mix has also got to be right too. In other words, there's no point in society maximising output if society is producing the wrong types of goods and services which fail to match consumer tastes and preferences. We'll only maximise utility if we're maximising output and we're producing the right types of goods and services that match the most immediate preferences of consumers. So as I say here, economic development will be low if we're maximising the output of things that ordinary people don't value. Economists who believe in laissez-faire argue that removing subsidies might promote economic development by changing the output mix of the economy for the better. For example, take opera, a pretty niche form of music these days. Most people in Britain either hate opera or they're totally uninterested in it. However, despite this, they're forced to fund it via their taxes. Most opera houses in Britain receive generous taxpayer-funded subsidies from the Arts Council. If opera subsidies were abolished, the equilibrium quantity of opera produced would fall. The price of opera tickets would also go up too. Some of the factors of production currently used to supply opera could then be redeployed to produce other goods and services which the general public prefer, that they place a higher subjective value on. Society's utility would improve if subsidies were removed from opera, because resources would now be allocated according to the wishes of sovereign consumers, rather than being allocated by a handful of elitist central planners who enjoy listening to fat ladies warbling along to obscure non-melodies for a couple of hours in a foreign language. That's opera. Sorry about that. A bit of a joke there, but in summary, removing subsidies is likely to create economic development, because removing subsidies will change society's output mix in a manner that pleases sovereign consumers rather than in a manner that pleases central planners. Because the tastes and preferences of central planners might be very different from what ordinary people want. And it's only the invisible hand of the market that will create that allocatively efficient output mix. And subsidies just get in the way of that by confiscating spending votes away from sovereign consumers. Because of course subsidies have to be financed. You could also argue that removing subsidies will create economic development, because getting rid of subsidies will promote dynamic efficiency within the economy. Dynamic efficiency describes a situation when either the quality of a product improves over time, or when the price of a product falls over time, because the firms have invented a new method of production that has reduced costs and thereby enabled the firm to charge a lower price and still make profit. Subsidies act as a guaranteed source of income for a producer. You know, if you're producing something that attracts a subsidy, it doesn't really matter whether consumers hate your product or not. You're going to get your subsidy payment irrespective. The more you produce, the more subsidy payment that you get paid by the state. So, therefore, you could argue that subsidies arguably disincentivize firms from being fully responsive to the changing preferences of consumers. Removing subsidies would therefore restore that incentive for firms to be market orientated. So it would force firms to become more efficient over time. This is the idea of dynamic efficiency, that things get better over time. So we get better quality products, we get lower prices because firms have been innovating. This is the idea of dynamic efficiency. And you could say that subsidies just stymie that process, because firms get paid an income in the form of a subsidy regardless of what they're producing and whether consumers want it or not. and also regardless of the fact that they're not particularly efficient and they've got high costs, and therefore they're charging high retail prices. Again, it doesn't really matter if a lot of your income is coming from mummy government in the form of a subsidy. You could also argue that removing subsidies will create economic development, because removing subsidies could lead to lower tax rates. So, as we all know, in economics, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Therefore, government expenditure on subsidies has to be paid for by somebody, somewhere, either now, or if it's the expenditures financed through running fiscal deficits, the people picking up the tab will be the future generation of taxpayers who will be asked to pay interest on the national debt that was run up by previous generations. Therefore, removing subsidies will definitely enable a government to cut its rates of income tax, because if you get rid of subsidies, government spending falls, so you don't need to collect as much tax income. A fall in tax rates will provide a supply-side boost to the economy by strengthening the incentive to work. If tax rates fall, working looks more attractive relative to leisure time. Lower rates of tax also make for a freer society. In high tax countries, the state provides goods and services that consumers may or may not like, through the public sector. In a low tax economy, people should be able to, or they do have the opportunity to spend a much greater proportion of the income that they've generated themselves by helping others. And you could argue that it just makes sense that you know your own tastes and preferences better than any central planner. So therefore, it's logical to allow people to spend their own money rather than taking the money from them and letting a central planner spend their money on their behalf. You know your own tastes and preferences better than a central planner. So therefore, how could you possibly argue that it would make sense to take money from people who know how to spend it best, that's you, and transfer it to other people called central planners to spend your money on your behalf? How can they possibly second guess your tastes and preferences? This is Mises's socialist calculation problem, or part of it. So if you remove subsidies, it promotes freedom, because people have now got more of their own income left to spend. You're giving people more of their own spending votes back, so they should be able to do a better job of maximising their own utility rather than their government spending it for them. Same principle. You could also argue that removing subsidies will create economic development, because subsidies encourage the wasteful use of factors of production. This should be fairly obvious, that subsidies encourage the overproduction of products that attract subsidies. Firms will keep on producing if the subsidy is high enough, even if consumers don't really want what's being produced. The image shown is a classic example. It's of a European Union butter mountain. The European Union subsidises the production of butter. So, surprise, surprise, European farmers produce way more butter than European households can consume. So, what does the European Union do with this overproduction? They store it. This is a colossal misallocation of resources. The factors of production that were used to produce and store this unwanted butter could have been used to produce something else that consumers did want to consume. So let's just look at a few logic chains that explain some of the arguments to the effect that removing subsidies can create development. So if we remove subsidies, production costs will increase. To preserve profit margins, firms will have to cut their costs. As a result of that, firms will have to find ways of improving productivity. Improved productive efficiency will lead to long-run economic growth, which will trigger material progress, which in turn creates economic development. So that's the first route through. Second route through is if we remove subsidies, the output of goods and services that consumers don't want will fall, like opera. Factors of production can be redeployed to other industries. The restoration of consumer sovereignty will change society's output mix for the better. That will create allocative efficiency, which then improves society's welfare, creating development. If you remove subsidies, firms will have to start innovating. Firms that don't innovate without subsidies will die. So that creates dynamic efficiency. Every year consumers get better quality products for lower prices. That creates material progress, which again creates development. If we remove subsidies, government spending will fall, obviously, because subsidies are a form of government spending. So that should make it possible to cut people's taxes without deteriorating the government's fiscal balance. You know, if you can cut government spending, you can cut taxes without increasing the fiscal deficit. If you can cut taxes, that will create stronger personal incentives to work. That will create supply side driven growth, material progress, and then again, economic development. Also, you could argue that if we cut taxes, we're giving people back the spending votes that they themselves have earned, and they should have the right, the freedom to choose what they want to spend their money on, because they've earned it. That should be part and parcel, surely, of living in a free society. The freedom to choose what you want to spend your money on that you've earned via voluntary, mutually beneficial exchange. So that freedom in itself will create non-material progress, but also you should be able to do a much better job of maximizing your own utility if you get to spend your own money rather than handing it over to a central planner who tries to spend your money on your behalf. So again, that creates development. So let's look at some arguments about why removing subsidies might not lead to greater levels of economic development. Indeed, like, how could we argue that removing subsidies is a really bad idea, and rather than development improving, it could go backwards? The first argument is pretty simple, is that if you remove subsidies, you're going to harm the poor. So if you remove subsidies, supply decreases because you're no longer having production costs being offset, so there's a reduction in the profitability of supply, and what that leads to is a fall in the equilibrium quantity and an increase in the price level. So basically the increase in price will make whatever was subsidised less affordable. Higher prices created by removing subsidies have got the potential to cut real wages. Obviously, in the exam, you could think about what exactly has had it, which product are we talking about here? Removing subsidies from food is going to have a really big impact on the poor, for obvious reasons, because the poor spend a very high proportion of their income on food. So if food becomes more expensive because subsidies have been taken away from food production, and that will leave less disposable income for poor people to spend on other goods and services. You can also argue that removing subsidies could reduce economic development by cutting output and employment. So again, if you remove subsidies, supply decreases. So the volume of goods produced also drops. So you'd say, well, how can that be good for development if less output is being produced? There'll be less available for people to consume. Also, you would say that if output falls, firms won't need as many factors of production, including labour. So subsidies could cause a decrease in the derived demand for labour It could lead to structural unemployment in the industries that used to receive the subsidies, and in developing countries where there might not be a welfare state, losing your job could be the #1 cause of poverty. You could also argue that removing subsidies might be a bad thing if you believe in protectionism. A developing country might be trying to diversify away from their primary product dependency by establishing manufacturing. By definition, its new fledgling manufacturing firms will be quite small because they've just been set up. So therefore, they might not have many economies of scale. So therefore, they're a high-cost producer. Because they're a high-cost producer, they're probably charging much higher prices than bigger, more established firms in North America and Europe. So the argument is that maybe these infant industries need subsidies until they grow big enough to achieve the economies of scale that are going to allow them to compete in global world markets. So the argument here then is that if you remove subsidies, those infant industries will die before they become 6'5" muscle men and being able to take on the world. So you could argue removing subsidies, it just makes it much harder for developing countries to escape primary product dependency by industrializing. Another way of evaluating is to write about what it depends on. So we're looking at the issue of removing subsidies and whether it improves development or not. Well, what does it depend on? The first thing that you could write about is, well, who's getting the subsidy? What are we actually subsidizing here? So the image on the left there, farm subsidies often flow to extremely rich people because for historical reasons most land is owned by very rich families basically. On the other hand, you could look at fuel subsidies in Ecuador. The poor need access to fuel, putting petrol, diesel in cars and stuff like that, or maybe they use fuel to heat food and things like that. So, removing subsidies from this millionaire farmer, maybe not so much of an issue. Removing subsidies from essential products like fossil fuels for poor people could cause enormous misery. Another factor is the price elasticity of demand for the product that's receiving the subsidy. So, as you know, subsidies, removing a subsidy will increase the cost of production, so it will reduce profit margins. So firms will respond to that fall in profitability out of self-interest by decreasing supply. So that's why the supply curve shifts to the left from S1 to S2. Now, if we're looking at a product that's price inelastic, like D1 here, what we can see is that the decrease in supply caused by the removal of the subsidy only creates a very small fall in equilibrium quantity from Q1 to Q2. But the price increase is pretty substantial, so that's not great for the consumer, a big price increase. A small fall in quantity is quite good news for the producer, however, because their revenue is going to hold up quite well. On the other hand, if we look at removing the subsidy of the same amount, same decrease in supply from S1 to S2, but this time the product is price elastic, as shown by the blue demand curve D2, you'll notice that the same subsidy removal has very different effects. So a much bigger fall in equilibrium quantity, so a much bigger drop in revenue for the producer. But the good news is really for the consumer. Removing a subsidy from a product that's got a price elastic demand creates a much smaller increase in price of P1 to P3. Your attitude towards removing subsidies will also depend on your economic perspective. So for a Keynesian, they see market failure everywhere. Subsidies are needed to correct market failures caused by merit goods and positive externalities, and to help combat inequality within society, subsidizing things that poor people spend a high proportion of their incomes on. On the other hand, Austrians would be very much in favour of removing subsidies because from their perspective, prices play a very important signalling role in the allocation of scarce resources between competing uses, and subsidies just mess that they send out false price signals. Also, Austrians would be wary about subsidies because somebody has to pay for them. So you're moving power from sovereign consumers towards central planners. Something else that it would depend on would be the state of the government's finances. So, for example, the UK's national debt is now over 100% of GDP. So we don't really have that much fiscal headroom left to go ahead and run big fiscal deficits because the stock of public debt is already very high. That means that in the future, a very high proportion of the taxes collected by the government are going to have to be spent on servicing the debt, paying interest to the bond market. And it could well be that in the future, if your debt level keeps on rising, that there could be a sovereign default. That's a situation where you're unable to collect enough taxation to pay for the debt interest on your huge national debt. So you could argue, well, if you're in a problematic position with a big pile of public debt, maybe one thing that you need to do is to start running fiscal surpluses, pay down the national debt, and you could run a fiscal surplus by cutting government spending. So that might involve abolishing subsidies, expensive subsidies. So we come to the end of another economics video. So I thought I'd collect some interesting quotes for you. So we'll start off with this one. The easy way to make money is to get special political privilege. From the beginning of time, business has cozied up to government and gotten restrictions on competition and subsidies and stuff. So what Charles Koch is basically saying here is that subsidies aren't a great idea because they can end up corrupting politicians. Politicians that grant subsidies tend to be rewarded by the companies who receive those subsidies. So that's the first one. Second quote, the ultimate objective of subsidies should be to empower the poor, to break the cycle of poverty, and to become foot soldiers on our war on poverty. So that's by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So that's obviously a very supportive kind of view on subsidies, and they're needed to create development. Subsidies are a shell game, not a net addition to national wealth. So that's a quote from the brilliant Thomas Sowell. What Sowell's basically saying there is subsidies don't create wealth. They're a shell game in that they just move wealth from one group to another within society. Subsidies aren't manna from heaven. They have to be paid for by somebody else. So subsidies, in essence, it's the state robbing Peter to pay Paul. Thanks to farm subsidies, the fine collaboration between agribusiness and Congress, soy, corn and cattle became king, and chickens soon joined them on the throne. It was during this period that the cycle of dietary and planetary destruction began. The thing we're only just realising just now. So, quote from Mark Bittman. So what this guy's basically saying is that subsidies can adversely affect the output mix of society, and the bit about environmental destruction, I guess, comes from the fact that subsidies incentivize firms to raise output, and firms in doing that might choose to produce food, in this case, using intensive methods of farming that aren't great for the planet. When the government makes loans or subsidies to business, what it does is to tax successful private business in order to support unsuccessful private business. So Henry Hazlitt, again, that's a very valid argument. Subsidies have to be paid for. So the businesses that receive subsidies, typically they're struggling. They need subsidies to survive. Where does the money come from? Taxpayers. So that could be successful private businesses that are being hit with corporation tax, or it could even be successful businesses who are being hit indirectly by high rates of income tax. So the government's paying big subsidies to businesses, certain specific businesses, the ones that have got close connections with politicians. That costs money. The government raises taxes. Households have got fewer spending votes to cast. So other businesses in the private sector don't sell as much because their spending votes, their customers' spending votes have been confiscated through high taxes, all needed to pay the subsidies to a select number of businesses that have got kind of crony special status. If the members of Parliament no longer consider themselves mandatories of the taxpayers but deputies of those receiving salaries, wages, subsidies, doles and other benefits from the Treasury, democracy is done for. Ludwig von Mises. So yeah, so basically it's again this point about how subsidies can end up corrupting politicians. Firms that receive subsidies will normally reward politicians who gave them the subsidy. So what happens then is that policy is enacted for the benefit of a small number of big businesses that have got the ear of politicians. So that's the end of another video about the removal of subsidies and whether it boosts development or not. And it's a nice topic because there's a very clear divide between Keynesians that are generally in favour of subsidies because they hate markets, and the Austrian school, which is obviously they have the opposite perspective. They would be in favour of removing subsidies, rolling back the frontiers of the state and giving more power to individuals and markets.